I'm Mike White. I was thinking, sitting here next to Gerald, that Henry Kissinger said a long time ago that of the British Labour Foreign Secretary, Anthony Crosland, that Tony is an acquired taste. Well, Gerald is one of my acquired tastes over many years. I'm slightly disappointed he isn't wearing one of his remarkable suits today. It's a tribute to the Leeds tailoring industry of his youth. I've never asked you this. I assume your parents or grandparents were refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe?
My parents.
Your parents?
Yes. My parents came from Poland, and they came to this country just before the First World War. And they came here because they were Jews, and they were being chased as Jews. In addition to which, my mother read books, and that was not approved of by the authorities in Poland. She read socialist books, and therefore they felt it best to leave Poland, and they came to this country. They lived for a short while in Hull, but then they ended up in Leeds, which is where I was born, and to which I still have very strong links.
What did your father do?
My father was a tailor in a tailoring factory.
I knew those suits were a tribute to the family.
My father was a tailor in Montague Burton's tailoring factory, and you're absolutely right, Michael. Until I went away to university, every single suit I ever wore was made by my father.
Well, that's nice. Now, you're a clever... Are you an only child?
No.
No, right. You're a clever boy, goes off to Oxford and is drawn to politics. But in those days, you were a Zionist of sorts, Pole Zion, that sort of thing. And I've worked it out, you must have been just about 18 when the British mandate ended in disorder and the State of Israel was declared and recognized by both the superpowers. So I really wanted to ask, some people in this audience will know this story, and I know you've made a television film about it, but I don't know it. Tell us about your journey from being a youthful Zionist to being such an articulate critic of the State of Israel and its government.
The State of Israel was founded, in fact, when I was 16 years old, and my family were, including me, were passionate supporters of Zionism and the foundation of the State of Israel. In our kitchen in Grange Avenue, where we lived in Leeds, we had a Jewish National Fund box on a shelf, and everybody who came to the house was expected to put some money into that box to help the Jewish pioneers in Palestine before Israel was founded. And yes, we were very strong supporters of Israel. I went there for the first time in 1961, and I used to go at least once a year, if not more, for very, very many years.
Was this to a kibbutz, or...?
Well, to begin with, I just went as a tourist. I had some friends. Richard Crossman, the Labour MP, who was part of the Anglo-American report that led to the foundation of the State of Israel. Richard Crossman had friends in Israel and gave me introductions to them. And then I went there and I met many, many politicians. Indeed, the only Prime Minister of Israel I have never met, two Prime Ministers of Israel I've never met personally, Moshe Sharet and Ariel Sharon. I've known all of the rest of them, and many of them have been friends. And after my first visit, I made close friends in Israel, whom I used to go and see regularly. And one of them was a family who lived in a kibbutz, the kibbutz Yagur, near Haifa. And we became extremely close friends, and I used to go and stay with them every year, and they used to come and visit me in Britain as well.
So what happens in the history of Israel, Palestine? What's the hinge year or the hinge event which complicated your, what sounds like an affectionate relationship with Israel and its citizens? I noticed you didn't go there till 60, that's after Suez and what must have been the Second War. When did you turn in your mind?
If I can just say that I was always worried about certain aspects of what went on in the Middle East, and when there was the Anglo-French-Israeli collusion, the invasion of Suez in 1956. I was one of those who was strongly opposed to that, and indeed I had personal differences with members of my own family because of that. But the key hinge moment, as you put it, Michael, was when I was writing a book about Israel. I'd written an earlier book to celebrate Israel's 25th anniversary called To Build the Promised Land. And I was later, in the early 1980s, asked to write a further book about Israel, about how things had developed in the country, and my own reactions. And I travelled about a good deal in Israel for the writing of this book, driven by my kibbutznik friend. He took me all over the place. And I remember where it hit me. And it hit me when we were driving through what is now referred to as the West Bank. And we'd just been to a Jewish settlement, spick and span, lovely houses, nicely paved. And then we drove across less than 10 minutes to an Arab village. And the Arab village was decrepit, people were living in poverty, there was sewage going down the main street. And I thought to myself, this isn't right. It isn't right that in this very small, constricted area, one group of people who happened to be Jews were living in this affluence, and a few minutes away, another group of people who were Palestinians were living in this abject poverty. And that really sparked it off, and I wrote about that in this book, which was called Inside the Promised Land. In fact, that wasn't its original title. The original title was The Decline and Fall of Liberal Israel, but the publishers thought that was a bit too provocative at that time. So we called it Inside the Promised Land.
Would they think it too provocative now, do you suppose?
I think they probably think it was playing it down a bit.
Yeah.
But I've always, because of my family and because of my heritage, and because most of my parents' families were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust, I've always believed in a country that's a home for the Jews and where the Jews can feel safe and govern themselves. And what has troubled me is that although certainly the Israeli Jews govern themselves, and they had an election not long ago, last year, it's now not a refuge from the ghetto anymore. I've got in my house here, a few minutes up the road, 2 pictures that I bought once when I went to Venice. And they're pictures of the Venice ghetto, which was the very first ghetto, ghetto being an Italian word. And what troubles me on behalf of the Israeli people is that they are now enclosed in their own ghetto. The wall, or if you don't like calling it a wall, the security barrier or whatever it is, that curls right down Israel, okay, is designed to lock out Palestinian terrorists. And it also locks out Palestinians living, for example, in Bethlehem, which is now very, very difficult to gain access to, and Rachel's tomb there can only be gained access by Jews, even though it's holy to all monotheistic religions. But one of the things that troubled me one day when we were driving along in the West Bank and alongside the wall is that it's not simply fulfilling its intention to a very considerable degree of locking out terrorists and locking out Palestinians, but it's locked the Israelis in. They're prisoners once again of a wall inside a ghetto. And that was not what Israel was founded to be. Israel was founded to be a place where Jews could feel free without oppression. And that stopped, and I'm very sad about it.
This journey of yours, I can remember, for example, I'm younger than you, thinking after the Six-Day War of 1967, well, they're no longer the underdogs now, and one has an underdogger's instinct. You don't work for the Guardian for the money, not primarily, so you're an underdogger, and I think that incidentally is where the paper's sympathy has changed. It was always a puzzle given its support for Israel in the early days. But and then Sabra and Shatila and events of this kind, the invasion of Lebanon, and this was what you're describing came a little after that, am I right?
It was around that time, though not necessarily directly connected with it. But you put your finger on it, Michael. I was very closely connected with the Israeli embassy in London throughout the Six-Day War. The moment I was working at 10 Downing Street then, yeah. And Harold Wilson sent me every day to get intelligence reports from the Israeli ambassador.
Harold was a keen supporter of Israel, wasn't he?
Yes, very much so. And I used to go to the Israeli embassy every day to have discussions with the Israeli ambassador, a very good and nice man called Aharon Remez, whose father was one of the great founders of Israel. And he would give me reports about what was going on in the ground there. And then I would go back and give them to Harold, and Harold would give them to our intelligence services. The Israelis knew this was happening. It wasn't underhand. And then, when the war ended, within a few days of the war ending, Harold Wilson sent me to Israel to see what was going on and to meet the Prime Minister.
Were you the political secretary then? I can't remember.
I was one of his personal advisors on his personal staff. I wasn't a civil servant. And I remember being troubled at that time, and I discussed it with the Prime Minister, that Palestinians who were wanting to get out of the war zone and were wanting to cross the Jordan by the Allenby Bridge found it extraordinarily difficult to cross and were being hampered by Israeli troops. And I said to the Prime Minister, please lighten up on this, allow them to cross. They're refugees, and you as Israelis know what it's like to be refugees. And he did listen to me, I've got to say that. But that was the key point, because the Israelis won. They won overwhelmingly, and they didn't know what to do with their victory. There were different ideas about what should be done. And one close friend of mine, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, Yigal Allon, who lived in a kibbutz near the Sea of Galilee, and whom I always used to go and visit and stay with, he wanted a plan whereby the Israelis would withdraw from all of the conquered territories, but have a line of fortifications along the Jordan to protect Israel. But he didn't win. And they got into a terrible, terrible muddle about what to do. They'd been okay, if you can say that, as a repressed minority. They knew what to do when they were in that very narrow slip of land that emerged from the 1947 to 49 war. They didn't know what to do as conquerors.
But I think I read recently Amos Oz, distinguished Israeli writer.
Wonderful man, whom I met and talked with.
I assume you know them all.
Yes, let's take that for granted,
okay.
And then it doesn't sound too big-headed of me.
Okay. Oz, I think, wrote recently that, to a man with a hammer, everything is a nail, and he expanded that by saying that if you've been subjugated by other powers for at least 2,000 years since the fall of the temple, and you get your own chance to throw your own weight around, then there's a temptation to do it too much. Now, as a psychological interpretation of what you're describing, do you recognize that?
I do recognize that, and I recognize something else that Amos Oz said, and it's been with me for a very, very long time, and that's this. He wrote a book of essays called The Slopes of Lebanon, and in that he had an essay in which he castigated his own people, the Israelis, trading on having been victims of the Holocaust in order to oppress the Palestinians, using the fact that millions of Jews had been murdered to imply that if you've been a victim, whatever you do is justified. And he wrote this lacerating essay, which I recommend to everybody about this. And that really had an effect upon my own thinking. Because as I say, Michael, the overwhelming majority of my parents' own families were murdered in the Holocaust. I did not regard the fact that the Germans walked into my grandmother's bedroom in the town of Stashov and shot her dead as a justification for Israelis killing Palestinians. And we've just, if you'll permit me to say this, there's a group of Jews, some in America and some in Israel, who are looking at what happened to the Jews of my mother's hometown, Stashov, every one of whom was murdered. And the Germans rounded all the Jews up when they arrived, put them in a line, and marched them to the station to go in cattle wagons to a concentration camp to be killed, except those who weren't strong enough to walk. And those who weren't strong enough to walk, who included my grandmother, were shot on the spot. So Amos Oz, who's a very great novelist, apart from his political views, has put his finger right on it. And he illustrates the fact that you don't have, if you're a Jew, you don't have to agree with or support everything the Israeli government does.
I suppose a representative of the Israeli coalition, which includes the Labour Party at the moment, doesn't it? Some of them would. Got a lot of coalitions at the moment. They've got one in Australia too, one here. That on Netanyahu's side of the argument would say, well, we face an existential threat every day from our neighbours, many of whom have never acknowledged our existence, Hamas, Hezbollah, everybody knows the names, and we do what we do defensively. That's what they would say if they were sitting in my seat, notwithstanding what you've said. That is what they would say, would they not?
That's what they say, and lots of people, including myself, believe it's very short-sighted. I'll come in a moment to the question of the existential threat. The problem is, and looking at these talks that President Obama launched recently, it highlights it, and it was highlighted by President Obama's speech to the UN General Assembly last week. Some Israelis, including this right-wing coalition, including the Labour Party, which Ehud Barak has destroyed, 14 members of the Knesset, for a party which governed Israel without a break for 30 years. That's what Ehud Barak has done to the Labour Party in Israel. But Barak himself, Obama, and in your newspaper a few days ago, an extremely good Israeli journalist called Anshel Pfeffer, all basically said the same thing. Obama said, if we do not get a settlement within the year that he's laid down, demography will set in. Now, what does it mean, demography will set in? It means that there are 5.7 million Israeli Jews. There are 5.2 million Palestinians, partly in Israel and partly in the occupied territories. The birth rate of the Palestinians is much greater than that of the Jews. And within a measurable period of time, there'll be more Palestinians than there will be Jews. And if Palestinians go on being what they believe, and many others believe, being oppressed, they will say, okay, it's terrible now, but we'll sit it out. And your journalist, and as I say, I think he's the best Israeli journalist I've read, Anshel Pfeffer, said in The Guardian a couple of days ago that if we go on like this, and if there's not a settlement, and if the demography sets in, then Israel will become an international pariah rogue state. Now, that's not me, Kaufman, saying
Although
that.
you've said it
I've
on more
said
than
it.
one occasion.
I've said it.
He's not a man for understatement, Gerald.
No.
No.
Yes.
Now, you've half answered this question, but you were instrumental in supporting the establishment of the Labour Friends of Palestine in the Middle East. What was the circumstances of that, and why was it necessary, and what has happened since that development?
There seemed to be no stop to it, and a number of us, separately, inside the Labour Party in the House of Commons, went to Israel for different purposes. I was asked by the Interparliamentary Union to lead the first ever delegation from the United Kingdom Parliament to the Palestinian territories. And what I saw there really saddened and, I have to say, angered me. Hundreds of checkpoints, people being made to stand in the heat while Israeli soldiers treated them extraordinarily badly. It's one of the sad things about occupation, whether it's Israeli occupation in Palestine, whether it's British occupation in Cyprus, whether it's British troops in Northern Ireland, whatever. Decent young men who wouldn't dream of behaving badly or brutally at home suddenly become insensitive and brutal when put into an anomalous situation which they don't understand. And that's what happened when we were there at the IPU. One of my great friends in Israel, he had 4 sons, all of whom had served in the army. And one of them had been in the West Bank and as a soldier in uniform. And he said to me, Gerald, I'd like to see what it's like when I'm not an Israeli soldier in uniform. So I arranged with the Palestinian authorities for us to go there one day and go to the Balata refugee camp. And this, like most Israeli young men, was a very, very decent young man. And he was totally horrified by what he saw there. So I led this IPU delegation, and I found that it was worse than it had been. Then other colleagues...
You've been there before, yeah.
In terms of the status of Palestinians, the ability of Palestinians to be able to live their own lives, the ability of Palestinians to move around the country. For example, there's I don't know if it's still there, but there was a line of trenches dug alongside the roads, with roads, small roads leading to Palestinian villages. And the Israelis had dug trenches and filled them with excrement and sewage in order to make it more difficult to get to the Palestinian territories. And they couldn't get to their jobs, and they couldn't get to their universities, couldn't get to their schools, etc., etc. Now, others of my colleagues went on different delegations. I see my very good friend Martin Linton sitting in the front row, and he went on a different delegation, not the same one as I did. And he saw what was happening. And let me make it clear, Michael, these are people who go without preconceived ideas. They've not gone out with the idea that the Israelis are villains and the Palestinians are oppressed serfs. They go out and have a look. And it was because of that, and Martin was very much a leader in it, though I worked with him, and so did others. People decided that we had, as socialists, to give the Palestinians a voice inside the labor movement in this country, and that's what we've tried to do.
You've met the Hamas leader in Gaza. What was your impression as to how much room for maneuver he has and what he wants to do with the power which circumstances have given him, or impotence as well?
I was asked by an organization called the European Campaign for a Free Gaza to lead a European parliamentary delegation to Gaza early this year. There were 60 parliamentarians from 13 European countries, ranging from the Republic of Ireland to Slovakia. And we went there and we spent several days there. Now, we were given an option. We were given an option as to whether we wished or were ready to meet the Hamas leaders, taking into account that Hamas is, as it were, prescribed by the Quartet, the United States, etc. And all of us decided that we would. I myself had a view which I was taught by one of the most brilliant and eloquent Israeli politicians, Abba Eban. Yes, I knew him. He was a very great person. Yeah. He was a very great personal friend of mine, and we shared platforms all over Europe for peace in the Middle East. And Abba Eban said, "You only make peace by talking to your enemy." And that's what we did in Northern Ireland. It's what we did in Kenya. It's what we did with the Oka in Cyprus. You can't pretend that people don't exist, even if their views and their actions are opprobrious. And there's no doubt that many actions taken by Hamas are deeply opprobrious. And when I was the leader of the delegation, so I shared the platform in the Parliament building in Gaza, a Parliament building which the Israelis had almost destroyed by bombardment, with the Hamas leader. And I told him to his face, sitting there, that many of the things that he'd done I found deeply offensive. I didn't go there to crawl. None of my colleagues went there to crawl. We went there to see. And one of the things that, I won't say was a revelation to me, that's too much of an exaggeration, but one of the things that clarified the situation for me was this. I'd been led to believe, as most of us have been led to believe, that Hamas, because they have terrorist activities to their discredit, are a gang of horrible ruffians, semi-literate, etc. They're not like that at all. If you were to meet the Prime Minister of Gaza, the Hamas Prime Minister of Gaza, elected in a democratic election verified by international observers, rather more democratic election than the one that brought George Bush to the White House for the first time. Meeting that man, he was elegant, beautifully dressed, beautifully spoken. That in no way atoned for some of the things that Hamas has done. But one of the things that trouble me most about this present situation, even if the settlement issue tomorrow is somehow or other dealt with, is there's utterly no way of making peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians if you simply exclude Hamas. You don't have to say they're nice. In many ways, they're dreadful.
If President Obama, against the odds, and the new process, settlement-free zones tomorrow, all the difficulties, if they were able to put a deal together, if it wasn't accepted by Hamas, then...
Well, that would mean, it would mean that they'd have a deal for the West Bank. It would mean that they'd have a deal for Jenin and Hebron, etc., 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 Ramallah, etc. It would mean, if what's on the table is that there could be a decision to have Jerusalem as the capital of both countries, you could get all of that. But Gaza wouldn't be included, because Gaza voted, as I say, in a free democratic election to put the people of Gaza elected Hamas to be in charge. Now, you may well dislike that. I mean, I disliked the result of this general election on May the 6th. But it's an election, and I don't go into the House of Commons now and sit on the government side of the House, because I accept that we were beaten in the election. Now, there's no point in pretending that because Hamas in many ways are dreadful, that they didn't win an election. They did. And that being
people
said...
People vote for people in difficult circumstances. People vote for people who protect them, don't they?
Well, it's very interesting that you say that, Michael.
Well, I'm asking, I'm not saying it.
Yeah, as I gather it, the views of the Israelis are that the greater the pressure that they put on Gaza, the more likely the people of Gaza are to turn away from Hamas as the originators of their predicament. But it's the reverse. The more pressure that people put on Israel puts on the people of Gaza, the more they're likely to cling to Hamas, because among many other things, Hamas, dreadful it is, I won't go on saying that, but dreadful as many aspects of it is, does provide social services, does help to provide medical care. And that being so, I live in the real world. I long ago, it was under the leadership of Michael Foot, gave up living in some political fantasy land. You've got to deal with...
You uttered that famous phrase about the manifesto. We'll come to that in a moment.
Okay, Michael. But you've got to live in the real world. You could not have had a settlement in Northern Ireland without a reconciliation of some kind between Hamas, between Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionists. And Ian Paisley, and yes, he was a friend of mine, Ian Paisley actually brought himself to shake hands with Gerry Adams. Now, if you can do that, you can do anything, Michael, if you're determined to do it.
Now, I'll come back to that at the end because we want to take a couple of questions, but I would be failing in my brief if I didn't ask you about your domestic political career. How does a carpetbagger from the other side of the Pennines end up being an MP in Manchester, Hardwick, Gorton for 40 years? How did that come about? Whether or not you've regretted it, whether or not you hoped you might have got into the cabinet, which you could so easily have done at several points, since you wrote rather a good book on how to do it. How to be a minister, still in print, I think.
Michael, I've always been, if you come from a working class family with no money, which is what we had, I don't mean we lived in poverty, but we had no money. If you come from that kind of background, you can either decide that the glass is half full or you can decide that it's half empty. I've always been a half full person. And so although I got elected to the Shadow Cabinet 12 years in succession, God help us all, I didn't get into a cabinet, and one might say that was something that I missed. Okay, I missed it, but I got lots of other things. I got to be chairman of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee.
Certainly did.
Yeah.
Terrorised them for years.
And cleaned up the Royal Opera House.
And cleaned up the Royal...
But I'll tell you this, Michael. Here I am in Manchester, a Yorkshireman, and I've been a member of Parliament for, as you put it, Ardwick/Gorton for 40 years. Yesterday, I went to a meeting of socialist societies in an hotel near the cathedral in the afternoon. And then I had a GMB reception in the evening, and I had a gap in my engagements. And I'd had an invitation to a private view at a little art gallery in a back street in my constituency, the Bankley Gallery. So we decided that we'd drive up there and spend a little bit of time there before we came back to the GMB reception. So we went to the exhibition and we were driving along and by accident got into a cul-de-sac and drove along the cul-de-sac, and it was getting dark, and a man came to the door, and despite the fact that it was dark and I was sitting in a car, he saw me. And he waved and he put his thumbs up like that and gave a big grin. And as far as I was concerned, that made it all worth it. One of the things that has added to my life in an enormous way is my contacts with my constituents and the way that my constituents come to me. I had 2 surgeries over this weekend, lasting in total more than 4 hours. I got lots of cases. People come to me I've had a woman several times on the phone over the weekend about a bereavement in her family, which she asked me to take part in. I've been to Whalley Range High School for girls in the Fallowfield ward of my constituency, where they're just completing a £17 million building rehabilitation program. And I had the great good fortune to get to Oxford University. This constituency is my second university. It teaches me the whole time. It requires me to learn things which I wouldn't have learned otherwise. My parents wanted me to be a good Jewish boy and become a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor.
Surely not.
That was precisely what they wanted out of me. And neither of them lived to see me go into Parliament, though my mother lived to see me go into 10 Downing Street. And
she liked that, did she?
Yeah,
I thought she might, yeah. They tend to, don't they?
But I'll tell you this. I might have been richer. I would have been richer if I'd been a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant. But I wouldn't have been more content. It's every day that I get two thrills as a Member of Parliament. One thrill is to be able to walk into the House of Commons and sit on a bench there, even after all these years. The second one is to be in my constituency and to meet the people who've elected me, or some of them haven't elected me.
Of all the Labour leaders you've seen, including the new one, who's up there on the pinnacle for you?
I'm going to have to split it, Michael. Obviously, I can't talk about Ed because Ed's not been leader for 24 hours yet, so it will be unfair to start assessing him.
Am I right in thinking you were a Davidite?
I voted for David. I put Ed was my number 2, and he's now my number 1 because he's my leader.
And you're a loyalist.
I am.
Is it true you've never voted against the Labour government in the House of Parliament?
I've never voted against the Labour whip in 40 years.
I find that surprising for somebody so bloody-minded as you. We'll come back to Labour leaders. Explain this more extraordinary thing.
Apart from anything else, Michael, I'm a great fan of Broadway musicals. Yes. And I'm a great fan of Stephen Sondheim. This is getting somewhere. And I've met Stephen Sondheim on a number of occasions. And in his the musical of his that was his worst box office failure, but which I think is brilliant, called Merrily We Roll Along, there's a trio song about friendship. And it's 2 men and a young woman who's in love with one of the men, though he doesn't realize it. And they're singing about what it means to be friends. And they keep interrupting each other, which is the genius of Sondheim. And one of them says, friendship means supporting your friend if he's wrong. Another interrupts and says, when he's wrong. It's very easy to be loyal when they're doing what you want them to do. It's more difficult, but at the same time, it's more important to be loyal when they're doing what you don't want them to do. And the fact that you're loyal can sometimes mean that you can persuade them to do things or not to do things. For example, there was all this talk earlier this year about changing the law on issuing warrants for suspected war criminals who come to this country, with Tsipi Livni, the former foreign minister, being the target of a warrant. And my good friend David Miliband, the Attorney General, Gordon Brown himself, all said the law should be changed. And I went to see Gordon about it. And I explained to him, in my view, what the principles were, why the law shouldn't be changed. And I added at the end, you don't need to take this into account, Gordon. But in 40 years in the House of Commons, I have never, ever voted against the Labour whip. But if you do this, I'll vote against it. And whether that had any effect, I don't know, but they didn't do it. And I believe that, A, loyalty is probably the greatest quality in politics. Being reliable, not talking about people behind their backs, helping the people, your people who are in difficulty. As I did on a number of occasions, you may not remember it, you're extraordinarily well informed, of course, when we had the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Bill, and the government were going to whip us into voting for hybrid embryos. And I was strongly against that. And I persuaded the government in the end to give us a free vote on that. I'm not loyal because I believe that you're more likely to be listened to if you are loyal. I'm loyal because I believe that one ought to be loyal. That doesn't stop me being bloody-minded. It doesn't stop me giving difficulties to my own government behind the scenes and sometimes on the floor of the House of Commons.
Well, I've seen you do that too, once or twice, or possibly 3 times. Now, favourite Labour leaders?
I'll split that between Harold Wilson and Tony Blair. I worked for Harold for 5 years. He was a lovely man, and I got on extremely well with him and his family. He was a very, very, very clever speaker, and he was marvellous at catching the moment in public meetings. For example, in one of his elections, he addressed a public meeting in Llandudno, and a child started crying, and the mother got up and started taking the child out in order not to disrupt the meeting. And Harold Wilson called out, "Stay here, I want you here, this is about his future." Now that is marvellous, you've got to agree.
Of course, the baby would have been vetted now. And, and Blair?
And I think, from the moment I set eyes on Tony Blair, I knew he had to lead the Labour Party. When he came in as a young man in 1983, and I did whatever I could to help.
But he came in with Gordon Brown, hang on.
He came in with Gordon, and they happened to share an office together. In those days, the House of Commons office accommodation was very cramped. And they shared an office together. And from the moment they shared an office together, they became very great friends, but Gordon was dominant. Yeah. And although I liked Gordon, and he was a good friend of mine too, I saw that Tony was the one, that Tony had something that no other politician I had ever seen had. And I did everything I could to help him become leader of the Labour Party and to foster him. And when John Smith, who died, and John Smith, as you know, Michael, because you've got all these...
Even I knew him. Yeah.
Yes, no, but you'll know that John and I were the only 2 Boilermakers members of Parliament. Yeah, I knew that Tony had to be leader of the Labour Party, and when John died, I made him promise to me that he would stand for the leadership. And he said, there on the phone that evening, he said to me, "But Gordon wants it more than I do." And I said, "Tony, that's just too bad. This is your moment." And he had a star quality that I've seen in no other politician, but he also got incredible things done. All that list of achievements that Gordon listed in his speech to the conference yesterday, that was done by Tony, often with Gordon, and they were achievements. He wasn't just a glamour boy.
Yes, okay. That is a very good point on which to stop. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you all for being a good audience. Thank you for the team.
Can I thank Michael very, very much indeed for giving his time and conducting this event.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.